Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott, President of Bay Area Skeptics. And I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker. Now, if you're interested in the public understanding of science, you start with Dr. John Miller, who for decades has been the Dean of Scientific Research on this topic. If you're interested in the public understanding of science, you're very familiar with the National Research Council's publication, Science and Engineering Indicators, and it's well known to us, Chapter 7, the chapter that presents the results of a biannual survey of attitudes and knowledge of science of American adults. You know that article that you see periodically in the newspapers or on your social media or reporting and whatever, reporting of how only X number of Americans understand that the Earth revolves around the sun and takes a year to do it. That's the Science and Engineering Indicators. And that's the research that John supervised for more than 20 years. A political scientist by training, John's academic career has been spent at Northern Illinois University, Northwestern University, and most recently at Michigan State and the University of Michigan. Currently, he is Research Scientist Emeritus and Director of the International Center for the Advancement of Scientific Literacy at the University of Michigan. Now, don't let that emeritus title fool you. I haven't noticed any particular indication that he is indeed retired. In fact, he even got me out of retirement a couple of years ago to help on a paper that he and his colleagues were writing, and I was privileged to do so. And quite honestly, a paper that John asked me to help with back in 2005, Miller, Scott, and Okamoto has, I think, I've never really sat down and counted the citations, but I have every reason to believe that that single paper has more citations than all of the other papers I've ever written collectively. So it is with much pleasure that I can report that John D. Miller will be our Skep Talker tonight, my friend, talking about Are Americans Really Anti-Science? John, welcome to Bay Area Skeptics.
Okay. My pleasure to be here, and I look forward to having good questions, and it's good to see you again, if only on the screen.
I agree. It's been a long time since we've actually been in the same room together, probably at a AAA conference or something like that a while ago. But you've invited me to present at conferences that you have organized, and I've had you on panels that I've organized. So, you know, it's really fun. It's really fun to have this event with you again, because it kind of makes me feel like old times. This is pretty great. You know, I remember you told me once that the graphic from that Miller, Scott, and Okamoto paper, the one showing, this was a paper, dear listeners and watchers, that John collected the data for with an international consortium of other researchers. And it presented the attitudes toward creation and evolution, the attitudes toward evolution, I should say, that's more accurate, of nations all over the world. And one of the most appalling aspects of this particular graphic was that it showed way at the bottom of the diagram the United States, one notch above Turkey. So, this was quite horrifying to an awful lot of our fellow scientists and fellow citizens. But I remember you telling me once that that graphic was requested more frequently from Science Magazine than any other graphic that they had had in some, period of time that was quite impressive. Do you remember what that was? I mean, that was such a startling statistic. It was in bright 3-color, really quite dramatic.
Yeah.
That ring a bell at all?
Okay. Okay.
I'll tell you what. Why don't we just go ahead
Can you
and
see
have
it?
you go ahead, sir.
Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and this is one of my favorite topics. And so I'm very pleased to be here and share this with you. And we'll try to do it on a timely basis so that we can have enough time for questions and everything at the end. And thank you, Jeannie, for that very kind invitation, or very kind introduction. This question of what Americans think about science at the beginning of the 21st century is an important question, and it's also a very complex question. So what I want to do tonight is talk about a couple of things that are precursors to this that you need to think about, and then we'll come back to the heart of the question itself. So I want to say two things that are necessary before we discuss the question about are Americans anti-science. First of all, we live in a very complex world in which it is no longer possible for any individual to follow all the issues or all the subjects. It probably has not been possible for 200 years or more, but it certainly is not possible today. And our era of specialization is not just in some advanced technology, but it's in our politics and it's in all the issues of daily life. And sometimes I've talked to people who, particularly in European groups, who will say, well, why do you think that what evidence do you have that life is all this much more complex than it was in the past? And one of the things I would tell you is that consider the United States Congress, which has to legislate on a whole range of everything from foreign policy to economic policy to agricultural policy to space exploration. The United States Congress has 220 standing committees because no congressman or senator could possibly know all the issues. Everybody would like to say that they know the issues, but in fact they don't. And the 220 committees are both major committees and subcommittees. And I don't think there's another legislature on the planet that has this sort of structure. And the thing that makes it most interesting, I think, is that those 220 committees have 26,000 professional staff with graduate degrees, medical degrees, law degrees, and things like that. It takes a lot of specialists to just cover the legislation in the United States. Now, the ordinary citizen doesn't get 26,000 staff, and they can't cover all of those areas. So they have to make some choices, and they do. And usually a typical citizen follows about 3 or 4 political issues intently, the things that they know enough about to have a well-developed view. And in this era of specialization, we also simultaneously have just entered, at the beginning of the 21st century, we've entered the internet era. And vast amounts of information are now available on a smartphone that you can hold in your hand. And never in human history have so many people had quick and inexpensive access to truly vast amounts of information from an amazing array of fields. If you look back and think about, even people who had in their day a great library, Thomas Jefferson and other people, they would not have 1%, less than 1/100th of a percent, 1/1000th of a percent of information that's now on the internet. A few years ago, there was, I think, an MIT estimate that every day, 20 million pages of new information are added to the internet. I don't read that fast. So I'm not going to read 20 million pages every day. Neither can you. But the internet is fortuitously designed to supplement specialization, because now you can go look for the information you want, when you want it, and how you want it. And I want to talk more about these two topics very briefly, and then we'll turn back to the question of scientific, is there an anti-science attitude? And so we are in this era of specialization, and I think it will undoubtedly continue throughout the 21st century. And if we continue throughout if we manage to survive the 21st century, it will no doubt carry on to future centuries. But it is an interesting problem, particularly in terms of our democratic political systems. We expect citizens to be able to understand the major issues of the day and to make reasonable decisions. Everybody learned that in their textbook in high school. But this expectation is no longer viable. Citizens need to identify the subjects of greatest interest and focus on those items. On the occasion of the 20th, or on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington had a huge celebration, and they asked me to come and give a paper along with several other people, obviously, about, and my topic was, what should a good citizen have known in 1787, and what should a good citizen know in 1987? Well, I knew pretty much what I thought a good citizen should know in 1987, but I went back and did a little research on 1787. Obviously, I didn't have any firsthand experience. And it turns out that in 1787, most citizens, if you were white and male particularly, went to an annual town meeting, or usually they were towns and villages. And the items on the agenda had to do with, should we build a bridge across this creek? Should we repair this road? And things like that. These are things that any farmer would have known a lot about and could have made a very intelligent judgment about that, because they lived there, they farmed there, they used the roads, they used the bridges. But in 1987, we were debating nuclear power. Were nuclear power plants safe? Were they producing cost-effective energy, and so forth? That was a topic that, according to my surveys, maybe on a good day, 15% of the people could give you 3 good sentences about. It's complicated. There's a lot of arguments and a lot of things you need to know before you could come down to a judgment about nuclear power. And as a result, people specialize. They simply pay attention to some areas and not others. And I think that that's a extremely important problem for democracy, because we still have this idea that everybody should know everything. And that is a 17th or 18th century idea, and it certainly is not one that we should be entertaining. And because in terms of political science and in terms of American scholarship, the first person who made this argument persuasively, I think, was Gabriel Almond, who was a distinguished professor of political science at Stanford in your neighborhood. And in 1950, Gabriel Almond wrote a book called The American People in Foreign Policy. And he argued that, in fact, only 5 years after the end of the Second World War, a survey showed that only 1 in 10 people could tell you the name of the French Prime Minister, the Dutch Prime Minister, or the Italian Prime Minister. And he was bemoaning the fact that here we had taken on a leadership role in the world, and people weren't paying any attention to it. But he didn't say that in a blameworthy sense. He said those, after the war, many of the people, the veterans, came back. There was a GI Bill that they could go to college with or get technical training. They got married. They had children. They had a lot of other things on their plate. So, in the middle of trying to get through college, get married, start a family, you don't get up every morning at the breakfast table and say, I should be thinking about French politics today. That just doesn't wash. And so, in fact, his argument was that there's nothing wrong in a democracy of having some people who are knowledgeable to a considerable extent about some issues, but not everybody has to know agricultural policy or transportation policy or international trade or whatever. But that the society and the political system can survive with a fairly high degree of specialization. And then in 1983, having finished graduate school and some other things, I wrote a book called The American People and Science Policy. Almond and I had become good friends, and he wrote the foreword to my book and said nice things about it was good to see the idea of specialization being put into other ideas or other fields. And I mention this partly because, after all, Stanford is your territory. And secondly, I think that it's an unreasonable expectation that every person is going to be scientifically literate. And I've made a lot of my career on scientific literacy. And I think it's unreasonable to expect that everybody is going to have an informed opinion about science. Just as he argued that it was unreasonable for people to know about foreign politics and to know about foreign policy. So anyway, I think that you need to think a little bit about the degree to which a lot of people may be very knowledgeable about some field and they may know nothing about science. And there's a little pyramid that I've often shown people, because the question is, if you're going to have a democracy, how do you make policy if most people don't know anything about it? Well, in science policy, this little pyramid, this would work in agricultural policy or foreign policy or other things. But I can just illustrate it to you in science policy. At the top of the pyramid, there are decision makers. These are people who can make binding decisions. These are people who, when they say we're going to do something, it becomes the law or it becomes an administrative edict. And there's about 200 of those in the United States. It's the president, the cabinet, the leaders of congressional House and Senate committees on science and technology and related fields, and probably the Supreme Court, to throw them in. But the number of people who really can make a final decision on science is not more than 200. Now, below that is a group of policy leaders. These are people who lead the American Chemical Society, the American Physical Society, FASEB in biology. And it involves people who are officers of major universities and corporations. If you think about science policy in the United States, you certainly would want the president of MIT, the president of Stanford, the president of UC Berkeley, and so forth, as people who would weigh in from time to time on science policy. And it turns out there's about 8,500 people who qualify. And I made a list of those once upon a time. It was a very popular list. Everybody wanted the list of policy leaders. including some federal funding agencies who were willing to be helpful. But these 85, 8,500 or so policy leaders are in practically daily discussion with decision makers. And about 90% of science policy is resolved between the policy leaders and the decision makers. And it doesn't go any further. And in most specialized areas, the institutional policy leaders and the decision makers interact in agriculture, in transportation, and energy, and so forth. But below that are the attentive publics. And I'm going to talk more about how you get to be attentive. But the attentive public becomes useful when there is a division between policy leaders or between policy leaders and decision makers. And I want to talk about these three levels of the public because that has to do with how much understanding you can expect in some various groups. Now, people who say that they are very interested in science and technology and they believe that they are very well informed about it, we call those people the attentive public for science and technology. They read the New York Times science section, they subscribe to science publications of various kinds, and most importantly, they feel comfortable enough to write a senator or a congressman or the president and say, I think you ought to do this or that. And in the case where the decision makers and the policy leaders cannot agree, then the attentive public is brought in. And certainly in the nuclear power issue, that has been the case. It's also the case in climate policy. In some cases, the agreement is so high among science leaders and policy leaders, and policy leaders and the attentive public, that they don't have to go to the attentive public. But if it happens, and it does happen at all times, there's probably one or two or three issues where policy leaders are trying to activate the relevant attentive public. Now, there's a second group of people who are very interested in science and technology, but they do not feel well informed. And these are called the interested public for science and technology. And we know from the last 30 or 40 years of my work that these individuals watch NOVA, they buy science magazines, they attend science museums, but they very rarely would write a letter to a congressman or a senator. They don't feel comfortable with their own knowledge. Very early in my career, I worked briefly as a legislative assistant to a U.S. senator. And that's mainly a speech writing position, I should tell you, but nonetheless, the senator would often give me a pile of letters and say, draft things for me. I never saw a letter that said, Dear Senator, I don't know much about this question, but here's what I think you ought to do. I don't think that letter was ever written by anybody. The people who write policymakers believe that they really know what that person should be doing. And that's why this attentive public, or the interested public, they have probably as much interest as the attentive public. They just don't feel well informed. And the remaining thing is the residual public for science and technology. And one of the things that I used to have to say periodically to the people at the AAAS meetings, I think for about 30 years in a row, I give a paper every year. And one of the things that you have to remind the scientific community of sometimes is that because a person is not a member of the attentive public, or they're not even a member of the interested public, doesn't mean they're stupid. It means they may be really interested in something else. I mean, I really don't care if Yo-Yo Ma doesn't follow science, as long as he continues to play the cello. I don't care if the people who grow soybeans and corn and worry about agricultural policy um, care about nuclear power or not, but they really do need to be careful and think about the food supply. So we are all members of many, many residual publics. I could fill several books with a list of all the things that I'm a member of the residual public for, because I just don't have time or interest to try to keep up with 50 items. Nobody does. Now, this is a graph that shows you that over the last 63 years how interest in public science and policy and attentiveness and knowledge went. The top blue line, I think if you can see the coloring, with the top line is the people who are very interested in science and technology. And as you can see, it finally has gotten as high as 58%. But back in 1957, in the first survey, I want to say I did not do that survey. I was a junior in high school and I had not yet thought about doing national surveys. But it was conducted by University of Michigan, sponsored by the National Association of Science Writers and funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And interestingly, it was completed in early September of 1957. And Sputnik was launched in October 5th of 1957. So this survey was finished about a month before Sputnik. And as you can see, a lot of things changed after that. People got a lot more interested in science and technology and so forth. But the level of people feeling informed about it only crept above 20% once back in the late 90s and once in the last 4 or 5 years. But the number of people who are both well informed, are very interested and very well informed, is the red line on the bottom. And that was about 6% back at the time of Sputnik, and it's now about 18%. Some people, when I show this chart, say, oh my goodness, science is really failing. That's not true. If you look at these, because we live in a complex society, the largest attentive public is healthcare, because we all don't want to get sick and die. And that's about 35%. Economic policy is about the high 20s, 28, 29%. Foreign policy is 5%. Agricultural policy is 5%. Foreign policy is about 10%. Agricultural policy is about 5%. And climate is about 15%. Science and technology policy does reasonably well in a specialized market. It may not be a majority, but no field has a majority of American citizens who are attentive to it. We are genuinely a dispersed population in regard to our interest. Now let's turn briefly for 1 minute to the internet again. I want to say just a couple of things about that. In the 20th century, the acquisition of information started with local newspapers, and then it moved to new electronic modes, namely radio, motion pictures, television, and cable toward the end. It is really appropriate to think of the 20th century as the broadcast era, because the information was usually broadcast from a central point to a passive audience, and people could listen. It's surprising sometimes, but at the beginning of World War II in 1940, about 30% of American households didn't have electricity, which means they couldn't listen to the radio. But by the 1950s, that number was up to 90% of the people had electricity or more. And then eventually motion pictures and television and cable. But all of those were centralized messages aimed at people who were sitting, listening, or looking at the television. But in the 20th century, the primary mode of information has moved very quickly. 21st century, we've moved very quickly to um, internet and all the associated devices, phones, tablets, laptops, tabletop or desktops, and so forth. We can think of the 21st century as the internet era. And what it means is that individuals acquire information about the things that they're interested in. And they get that information from people and sources they trust at times of their own choosing. For a long time, in the late 50s and early 60s, the three major networks at that time had agreed that each of them would have evening news at 6:30. So in the United States, at 6:30 in the evening, you had two choices. You could watch television and watch the news, or you could turn off the television because there wasn't anything but news on. British have done that for years. They've had BBC One and BBC Two doing news at the same time, so there wasn't any other choice. But when the internet comes along, now you've got thousands of choices. And just like when cable began to break down the system so that you had hundreds of channels to look at, now you've got literally thousands, tens of thousands of websites that you could go to get information on any topic. So that makes a very different thing. And it's not centralized, it is decentralized, so that different groups can have a television station on YouTube. And I know some groups that I'm an officer of. We have now a couple staff people who just take care of our television set, our television channel on YouTube. The world has changed a lot. So having done that, let's come back to the question that we started on about are Americans anti-science. And our friends in politics and journalism tend to believe that adults have a simple linear view of attitude towards science and technology. They either love it or they hate it, but the reality is just a lot more complicated. I use a procedure called confirmatory factor analysis, which some of you may know and some of you may not. And I've looked at the last 6 decades. I want to share this with you very quickly because I think it would help you understand that asking about anti-science is probably the wrong question. What we found over the last 60 years of data, like I say, I was not doing it all that time, but for a fair amount of it, but not in 57 to be sure. But you ask about people's attitudes towards science, and one dimension is people's belief that science has produced benefits for them and for society and will continue to do so in the future. And that's very common. I mean, when you ask people, in a survey like I have done for 50 years, what's the most important thing, what's the most important scientific discovery in the last 50 years? It's antibiotics, it's the intensive care unit, it's the coronary care unit, it's other kinds of health-related things. And sometimes they'll say jet airplanes, and sometimes they'll say cell phones, which is not a bad answer. But these are all benefits that come from that. The other dimension is that people have some concerns or reservations about science, potentially negative outcomes from science. And these concerns may be religious, they may be environmental, they may even relate to cultural beliefs about what's right and what's wrong. And people can be concerned about various aspects of science. And so what I want to do is show you, I know you can't read this in detail because it's a very complicated table, but I want to read you just the statements that we have used now over this period of time to give you a sense of how we measure this. So if you read on the left-hand side, and if you can't read it, I'll read it. Science and technology are making our lives healthier, easier, and more comfortable. And there's a very high level of agreement. So on a confirmatory factor analysis like that, the loadings can range from +1 to -1. That one loads in 1957 at 0.99. You cannot get any higher than that. And in 2020, it loaded at 0.99. And in 2007, it loaded at 0.99, and so forth. That's the idea that science and technology makes our lives healthier, easier, and more comfortable is a good summary of that factor. And a second item is most scientists want to work on things that will make life better for the average person. And that has, back in 1957, 0.77, which is from +1 or 1.0 to -1.0 is pretty high. And on the third item was on balance, the world is better off because of science. And 0.58 is still very good. Remember, you're going from 1.0 to -1.0. So this is still in the very high portion of that thing. And if we could convert those into a 0 to 10 index, which is easy to do, it turns out in 1957 on a 0 to 10 scale that the average, this is for all American adults, age 21 and over, the average score was 9.3 out of 10. That's very, very high. And that reflects the post-war euphoria. We had solved we had a vaccine for polio. We had television. We had jet airplanes. And we had solved other diseases like tuberculosis. I've done some surveying on the recent pandemic with COVID, but most Americans don't realize, and I bet some of you will be surprised, that in the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century, 1 out of every 6 Americans who died of tuberculosis. We now know that it was caused by bacteria and antibiotics will cure it. But we didn't know that before 1940. And if you think about the magnitude of that, of every 6 people who died, 1 of them died of tuberculosis. Whereas in the COVID pandemic, 1 out of every 500 or something died. It was a very different number. But 1 out of 6 is very, very high. And when you cure things like that, people have a sense that this is pretty good stuff. On the negative side, the things that people are concerned about, we have a statement that says we depend too much on science and not enough on faith. And that has gotten stronger over the last 60 years. We have another statement. One of the bad effects of science is it breaks down people's ideas of right and wrong. And that has declined slightly, but it's still very significant statistically. And then a final one, that science makes our way of life change too fast. And that has gotten a little stronger. And if you look on the negative of the reservation thing, in 1957 on a 0 to 10 scale, the level of concern or reservation was 4.0. And 63 years later, it was 4.3. 0.3 is not much of a change over 63 years. So for the whole adult population, I think the answer to our question would be that the public appreciation of the benefits of science have continued to grow and are very high, and that the concern about science, the reservations about it, have been very steady from 4.0 to 4.3. They're still concerned, but the point is you can have both at the same time. People can say, there's a lot of benefits, and I'm worried about this, or I'm worried about that. So it's not an either or. If it was a straight either or, the correlation between the two factors would be -1.0. That's not the case. it's minus 0.46 in 57 and minus 0.42 in 2020, 63 years later. There hasn't been a lot of change going on in this. Some, but not a lot. And I think the answer is if you stop thinking about a single measure and you start thinking about how many people believe in the promise of science and how many people have concerns about it, then it's a question of magnitude. Do the concerns outweigh the reservations, or do the promise outweigh the concerns or reservations? And if you do see a picture of this graphically, this chart, the blue line is the number of, this is all U.S. adults 18 and over. And you can see back here in the 1957, it was 9.3. And then by 1988, which was sort of the end of the Vietnam War era, it had dropped to 7.3 or something like that. And then it has gone up since then a little bit, but it still is 8. So the benefits for all Americans would be, they would believe that they would weight the benefits of science at 8 out of 10. And in terms of worry and concern, it went up. In 88, it also increased. And then it began to decline, and it's always been between 4 and 5. It's never gotten higher than 5, and it's never gotten lower than 4. So at the same time, we can say that American adults have a high level of belief in the benefits of science and a lower level, half as much, concern about science. Now, if we also look at the attentive public, the line gets bigger. That is, that they also had a drop in the attentives from 57, which was, I think, 9.7, if I remember right, which is pretty nearly as high as you can get. And it dropped again in 88. There were a lot of people in the anti-Vietnam movement who couldn't get over the idea of napalm and what it does to children and adults when it gets all over their skin. So science took a fairly hit, but even then it never got below 7.5 among attentives. And the concern among attentives has stayed about 4, except between 2016 and 2020, which would be the Trump years. It went up a little bit from 3.8 to 4.8 roughly. And some of that was probably the continual attacks on science. But when it came down to the vaccination, in a paper I've written that it's been getting a lot of press, even conservative Republicans, a large proportion of conservative Republicans went out and got vaccinated and said that they weren't worried about it. They thought that it was a good thing. So even though there was an effort to sort of demonize that, it didn't actually work. So the answer is that these things are moving at the same time, and that the perception of the benefits of science is way ahead of the concerns about science. So I think we can conclude that the substantial majority of Americans believe that science and technology are producing benefits for individuals and society, and that there is a surge of recognition. There was a surge after the Second World War, reflecting new antibiotics, vaccine for polio, the development of jet aircraft, and the developing an effective treatment for tuberculosis and other things, television and color television even. At the same time, there's a minority of Americans, or many Americans have some reservations, but the mean score is only 4 out of 10. And some of these people reject evolution still. They reject findings of climate science and change, and some of them oppose genetic research on plants, animals, and humans. Um, but it's essential to recognize that individuals can hold a belief about benefits and some worry at the same time. It's not either or. And I think we need to try to get out of the habit of thinking of it as either or, and think about what are the things that the public are valuing about science in terms of its positive outcomes, and what are the things that worry or concern people about science. In recent decades, as everyone knows, we've had an increasing polarization of politics in the United States, and science has not been immune to this process. There's been some polarization effects in science. For several decades, right-wing conservatives have attacked schools, universities, and any other institution that seeks to convey truth from any source other than the Bible, or to oppose deep cultural beliefs like white superiority or equal participation by women. And on the left, Greenpeace and other groups have tried to gain popularity and power through attacking genetic research and genetically modified foods, which I think is in some ways equivalent to being a climate denier. I was glad to see on the Bay Area Skeptics website a lot of comments in that direction. I wrote this before I read their website, so I wasn't reacting to the website, but I was happy to see that there's that other people in your group see it similarly. And I think that in a recent analysis I published about Trump's attacks on science and on Dr. Fauci, I found that a significant minority of conservative Republicans recognize the scientific value of vaccines, despite Trump's political attacks on science. And you could say that health trumped politics. So you can smile about that. So anyway, that's what I would say about in answer to the question about are Americans anti-science. And what I want to also do is to give you my email for a very simple reason. I'm perfectly happy to share papers and things I've written with you. But if I was telling Jeannie, if I give the copy of the PDFs to the Bay Area skeptics and you put them on your website, I'm violating copyright law, which I don't want to do. But if you send me an email asking for it, I can give you a copy, and that does not violate copyright law. So that you can share your work with individuals on a one-to-one basis, and that is not a copyright problem. But if you hang it out on a website and say anybody who wants it can take a copy of it, that is a violation. So I think that Jeannie may be able to put up on the web some articles of possible interest. And so if you send me an email, I will send you back a PDF of the article. Anyway, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful. I appreciate it very much that you spent so much time with us tonight and sharing what I've always considered for many, many years, your very thoughtful consideration of this issue. I really think it's so important to do what you pointed out to us tonight, that there's people have attitudes very positive towards science, but at the same time, they can have reservations about science. I also want to toss in another idea and hear what you think about it. I think related to that kind of dichotomy is another sort of dichotomy, which is that, yes, I think science is really great, except for that science. The idea that, grandma's got a new hip, she's bowling again. Let's hear it from medical science. This is great. And yet those climate scientists are just a bunch of grant grubbing hacks who are trying to get more money to support their big laboratories. Like, tell us how scientific research is a get rich quick scheme, right, John? But I think that's part of it too. I think once you know, the people who supposedly are anti-science often are just anti-certain sciences which have consequences for their particular values or other strongly held beliefs. And it's those scientists that they work, like oftentimes climate science, evolution, genetically modified foods, the kinds of things that you have researched. But at the same time, they want their kids to study science. They're not anti-science in a generic sense. They think that it's really great. You pointed out conservative Republicans who got vaccinations during COVID. Even at the same time, they didn't like schools being closed.
Well, I think that in some issues, there's a lot of economic interest. So if you are, doing something with the oil industry, you tend to want to think of it as being not so really damaging. And even in West Virginia, for example, I've seen some interesting surveys that when you ask people about coal, which is the worst of the things to burn, they sort of acknowledge it, but they say, I don't have anything else to do. If you shut the coal mine, I'm going to starve to death. And so I think that just like when I was in DeKalb, the corn growers and the soybean growers and so forth would have said, that's what I do for a living. And so they would do that. So I think that sometimes people have been persuaded by the fossil fuel industries that it really isn't as serious as other people say. And it's interesting because we had another, obviously many people will remember, the several decades of fighting over smoking. Mm-hmm. And the tobacco companies said, well, it's not really all that dangerous. Look at all the people who smoke and are still perfectly healthy. And of course, that was nonsense. But nonetheless, I think that this idea of trying to minimize the negative consequences of something like smoking and like burning fossil fuels and so forth is a strategy that it ultimately did not work for tobacco, and I think it's not going to work for oil either. But again, you don't have to convince everybody in the population, because one of the aspects of issue specialization is we only have 18% of the people who are attentive. And if all 18% of those people began to pressure decision makers, that would work. So that you really have a much more targeted audience to try to reach out to.
I think we have some questions from our YouTube audience. Why don't we take a look and see what they want to talk about? Peter M. says, would policy leaders include lobbyists and or their bosses?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that the nature of the policy leaders is that most of these people represent organizations, and they were elected there, so that the chemist or the biologist or the other kinds of groups. But some of them could be. I mean, if you had people in the pharmaceutical industry or the energy industries who are representing that point of view, some of them might be called lobbyists. Many, I think of lobbyists as people who get paid for doing it. But there's a lot of people who are willing to be vocal about it, but they don't get paid for it because they are part of the industry in some way, or they've just they're convinced that that's the right thing to do. So, of the policy leaders, very few of them would be that you would if you looked at what they did, it would be just a few percentage points of people who might be paid lobbyists, because lobbyists are not the elected people. They're the people who get hired, in my view. So if you think of a lobbyist as being a paid person who's trying to do that, now I suppose if you think about the other possibility is that, for example, a lot of senators or congressmen, when they leave office, they then take a job with one of the advocacy groups, and they would be lobbyists. But uh, it, uh, so it's possible that there's some people who would be knowledgeable in a field and who would be trying to persuade their former colleagues, and they might be lobbyists in that sense. I don't want to exclude all lobbyists, but I think it's not a consequential number.
Okay. Is there another question? Howard Wynette says, Jay Rudolph suggests that teaching the nature of science rather than factoids should be the main goal of science teachers. Do you see any evidence for changes in teacher training filling this need?
No, I think that just doing factoids is not probably a very good way of teaching, only because it doesn't really generate interest among the students. You can memorize the facts, and then you forget them the next week after you pass the test.
Yeah.
And
Or worse, you don't remember them at all when you fail the test.
Yeah, but I think the being able to teach the nature of science is it's something that is hard for many science teachers to do, because they've never actually been that. Um, Sam Silverstein is a good friend of mine. Is a professor at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, and what he's been doing for the last 20 or so years is bringing in middle school and high school teachers to work in a laboratory with a university scientist, and they actually have a desk, a bench space, and they actually engage in working as other people in the laboratory do on some kind of question. And they, in the end, by the summer, they have now got enough data to make some minor conclusion. But it's an experience that most teachers have never had. These are called SWEPT programs, Science Education for Professional Teachers, I guess it is. I don't like that. Science Work Experience, I'm sorry. Scientific Work Experience for Professional Teachers, which spells SWEPT. So I think that helping teachers actually get into laboratories and into the work that scientists do, and becoming familiar with it is a good thing. And I think one of the advantages of YouTube is that instead of it's always been a dilemma for the scientific community as to this idea that we should send a scientist to every kindergarten. Well, there's more kindergartens than scientists, and you waste a lot of time doing that. But if you have a scientist who can sit on YouTube and talk about his or her experiences and why they got interested in it and how they pursued it and what studies they did and what kinds of academic studies they did to get there and so forth. And I think that kind of thing might be helpful, because then you can use the technology so that a very personable scientist, he or she could then relate to people in a way that, just like students relate to YouTube generally pretty well. They could have a scientist, or someone could be interviewing a scientist and do that, or just having a conversation with them. And I think that is that's part of the way you've got people interested in science. Um, but
You know, for the
what I
last
say is that it's not necessary that every person who uh, some people have gotten so into trying to train people to be STEM workers. Um, there's going to be a lot of business executives, lawyers, um, social scientists, and so forth who need to understand science, but they're not going to actually practice science.
yeah.
And so um, I find sometimes among my political science colleagues that they could stand a little more scientific literacy also.
Well,
Um,
everybody can. I mean, you know, when we talk about the scientific literacy, we talk about the scientific method, we talk about thinking like a scientist. What we're talking about is very basic critical thinking, is collecting information, coming up with possible explanations, and then testing those explanations. You do that if you're a good scholar, whether you're a political scientist, whether you're a historian, whether you're a natural scientist, a social scientist. Pardon me. Whatever kind of educated person you are, you're going to use those kinds of skills to make decisions. And it's not something that scientists have hidden away and are protecting to our own, you know, for our own purposes. It's something that's very general in educated and thoughtful people. Critical thinking is not something that scientists invented. I often remind people, because people don't actually know or remember, that some of the best critical thinking is actually done in um, college writing classes. A lot of time in freshman writing classes, the teacher will say, well, you know, write an essay where you try to persuade someone, and you'll learn all about, you know, good rhetoric and bad rhetoric, so to speak, ethical ways of persuading people, and the tricks that you should try to avoid and be able to recognize. There's actually a fair amount of critical thinking taught in literature classes, or not literature classes, and writing classes, English classes. But I just wanted to point out that for the last, at least 20 or 30 years, there has been a movement in science education away from the factoids, away from memorization, and toward experiential learning. You know, you wouldn't teach music by having students read about oboes.
yes.
You would have to have some experience playing an instrument or,
Right.
pardon me, something caught, or just to take your analogy, um,
I was
listening to
hoping you'd drink of my water, but it's a little hard to pass it around over the internet.
yeah, which would be sort of the equivalent of your YouTube example of, you know, hearing a scientist talk about how he or she came up with a conclusion and tested it and so forth and so on. Now, I think that there's more going on in science education than many people believe. At the same time, the ship of science education is a very large one and it steers slowly. And unfortunately, we're not funding it right. So the easiest things to test are facts. And so that's what teachers unfortunately have to spend more time on than they really should. In the better school districts, that's happens less frequently. Can we have another question, please? John Massey writes, to what extent do studies differentiate between science and technology, knowing, of course, there is overlap?
Well, I have spent earlier in my career a number of years working on that problem for the National Science Foundation. They kept believing, because at NSF there are science divisions and there are engineering divisions and so forth, that there really was in the public mind a very good differentiation between science and technology. Um, but in fact, if you ask people about major scientific discoveries, they almost always give you back technologies, because that's the thing that they encounter. So when you go to a hospital and you see an intensive care unit, that looks very scientific because it's got all of these things that they connect to you and whatnot. Um, but I think that uh, the we've tried many times. Some of you may know Todd Laporte, who was at Berkeley for many, many years. I think he's retired now. But Todd and I and some other people used to try to write questions to get a differentiation between uh, science and technology. And we really, only people who were very well informed and had probably worked in science and had a lot of college level science courses could really give you an answer. And even there, not always a very clear answer, because um, what some people would say is that good science produces technologies. That if you learn enough about immunology, you may be able to make a better vaccine. But the vaccine is a product, and the understanding of the immune system is science. But you can't get to a vaccine if you don't understand the science. And so, in that sense, uh, it's a little bit of a um, false dichotomy. There's very few things that are, I think, technologies that have no science behind them. But there's some things that are um, adaptations of things that happen in nature. Um, the For example, on this debate about what you can you patent and what you can you not patent.
Mhm.
If you There's certain plants that are resistant to freezing. They can have you can have rain and you can be freezing, and the water rolls off them. And there's other plants that, given the same circumstances, die quickly. Um, and scientists then began to look at this, and they discovered that there are little grooves in the leaf that channel the water off. Some of them are microscopic, but they are there. And so then some, engineers looked at that and said, "Aha! If we did the same thing with airplane wings, if we cut little grooves in them, maybe the water wouldn't freeze." And they did, and it worked.
Hmm.
So the question is, can you patent that? And the answer was yes, because even what you couldn't patent was the idea of the grooves. But what you could patent was the application of the grooves to an airplane wing. So I think that's where the science and technology comes in. They are even if someone who learns a basic um, and in the nanotechnology thing, the idea of buckyballs has been very interesting, which came out of scientific work, but it now is used to construct things. And so it's a messy line in the middle. And I've increasingly just given up and said science and technology, because when you're doing surveys, you don't get that many minutes. And so if you try to stop and explain to everybody what is a science and what is a technology, you've just lost your interview.
Yeah. And in most cases, it probably doesn't matter because that's not the information you're looking for.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Next question, please.
Yes.
Peter M. asks, aren't there a lot of members of the public who believe that they are pro-science but anti the scientific establishment, which they see as corrupt? It's sort of like being pro-religion but not liking the priest.
Well, one of the things that we have looked at is um, the difference between the public's perception of a university scientist and a corporate scientist. Because we first came across this in the tobacco disputes. There were people from universities and medical schools saying it'll kill you, and there were people from the tobacco companies who were doctors, and they had their little white jackets on and their stethoscopes, and they said, "Oh, it's not really all that bad." And people began to distrust scientists who were selling something, and they figured that out. And I think um, that the issue is that university scientists have gotten themselves into a special place where people think that they are not um, working for a company. Now, I know some people have been critical that companies do provide uh, grants and things for universities, and there is some of that to be sure. But if you look at university research, about 85% or so of it's paid for by the federal agencies. And most of that, they keep their hand, most of that is awarded by peer review committees, not by the administrators. Um, and so I think that uh, the idea of corruption is oftentimes more involved with corporate work than it is with university scientists. Um, there have been some examples of medical scientists who have taken money to endorse a particular drug or a particular activity, and that's unfortunate. Um, they hurt the entire enterprise when they do that, but I think it's not widespread. I think that the amount of at one point I spent 6 years as a professor in a medical school as a political scientist, but they were getting ready to invest $3 billion in stem cells, and they wanted someone who could survey the public on stem cells. So I learned a lot from my medical colleagues. But I think that there's a lot of self-regulation inside of the medical schools. And I think the public doesn't see that necessarily, but I think it's there. And so I think that most universities and most medical schools now have learned how to police activities. So if someone's going out and saying, "Oh, this is if you just take this medicine, your cancer will go away," and so forth, I think that would cost you your job in most medical schools, particularly if you're selling, carrot juice or something.
But I think perception has a great deal to do with it, for certain.
Well, there have been some bad actors. There's no question about it, but I don't think it's predominant. In fact, I think it's really quite minuscule.
Ashok Varma asks, our country many times seems to be moving more toward religiosity and anti-science. How can we compete with countries whose religion is science?
Um, well, I'm not sure that we have a country whose religion is science. We have a lot of countries whose religion is non-science. But I think that in our country, um, there's an interesting thing that survey people know, but a lot of people don't because of coverage in the media. But in the United States, about 30% of people are Republicans, and the majority of those are conservatives. About 30% are Democrats, and most of those are liberals, but not all. There's a 40% group in the middle, which is larger than either end, who say, "I don't want to be a part of a party. I want to think about this," and so forth. So the country actually, even though we have this polarization, we have a check and balance in the middle. You still, in order to get to 50%, you've got to get more than half of the people who are not Democrats and not Republicans. And even though the people on the ends of the spectrum get more TV time and more newspaper time and more web coverage, the fact of the matter is that you win and lose elections in the middle. And the only place that doesn't work is if you have states that are so red or so blue, there isn't any middle left in those states, or at least a very small one. But across the country as a whole, we still have 40% of people who refuse to call themselves either a Democrat or a Republican, and they are the balancers that give us some common sense. So I think that I don't think it's as dire as the question implies. Um, there, I've been measuring fundamentalism for a long time, and I think that it's under 30% nationwide, and it's actually declining some. I have a longitudinal study of people I've been following since the seventh grade until they are 48 years old, and over that time period, even though some of them grew up in very fundamentalist families, that declines with experience in life. So that if you just look at the Generation X, which is where these people are at, um, many of them started out in more conservative homes, but over the last 30, 40 years after they got out of high school, they have moderated it in lots of ways. There are still some who are quite conservative and are quite fundamentalist. It's not 100% change, but there's about 15, 20% of the group who started out conservative who have become moderate, at least. So I don't think it's a dire situation right now. I think that uh, there's a we saw those charts. I think that I think that the great majority of Americans think science is a good thing,
Mm-hmm.
and I think
Exactly.
that almost nobody wins elections by running against cancer research. And nobody wins elections by saying shut down the laboratories. Um, so I don't, and in fact, most parties try to avoid those kinds of things. We've managed to have a space program now for 60 years that is still pretty nonpartisan. You've got support almost equally out of Democrats and Republicans on that, and uh, I think the support for the National Institutes of Health,
Sorry.
and it's in the 80 and 90% range, and almost nobody wants to damage the National Institutes of Health. So I think there's a lot of support for science, and particularly for some of the basic science. Um, I think the number is right. We spend more on biomedical research in the United States than the rest of the world put together.
Yeah.
And, that's been true for 30 years or more. Um, so I think that there's a lot of basic science that still gets done, and I don't think that the fundamentalists are in some states they have a great deal of sway. There's no doubt about that. But across the country generally, and when you add up all the congressional seats, they are not a majority anywhere. So I think that it's not as dangerous as sometimes the press makes it sound.
I think you're correct. May we have the next question, please? Gia Diamond writes, if it's not realistic to expect the residual public to be scientifically literate, what's the base level we should expect from them?
Well, I think that in this residual public, what you have is what I would call an appreciation of science. It's like music appreciation. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you don't have to be able to play the piano or play a cello to appreciate music. And I think that there's people who look at the tangible benefits of what they've got. A member of their family had cancer, but they got it treated and they actually recovered.
Mm-hmm.
Or they had heart disease and they did something else and they saved their life. So I think there is a residual feeling about that. I think you have to have, well, there's two groups, and Jeannie, you know this better than I do, because the people who oppose evolution do it on a biblical basis often and not on a scientific basis. It's not that they had different science courses. They just basically they start out with a premise that the book of Genesis tells us all the science we need. And there's no combating that. You're not going to make people scientifically literate out of that. But I think that a lot of people can be, you can improve their understanding in areas that they are interested in, but not in areas that they're not interested in. So, I think that we've done a pretty good job, for example, in getting people who do their home gardening to be sensible about pesticides. I think there's a lot of people who are worried that they're going to get poisoned, and they're rightfully so. And but they're not going to go out and study nuclear power because it's not something of interest to them. So I think what you have is this appreciation that yes, science does good things, and I'm not sure how it works, but it seems to be okay.
I've often encouraged teachers and people studying public understanding of science to consider the joy of science.
Yes.
You mentioned music appreciation. Well, there is such a thing as science appreciation. I can enjoy music without being able to, play an instrument, or even if I were tone deaf, I could still enjoy science. I don't have to know how to set up a double-blind study in order to enjoy reading about the results of an experiment.
Yes.
The science is a wonderful, enjoyable human experience, and anybody who is a teacher or a professor should work very hard to dissuade people from the idea that science is something that's ungraspable by normal humans. But don't let me get on my soapbox. Anyway, we're going to have to wrap this up, I think, because John is from the Eastern time zone, and we're starting out here in the Pacific time zone, and he's been up for a long time. This is getting to be very late your time of day. I want to thank you very much for being with us tonight, John. This was really fun, and I know we got a lot of people asking a lot of interesting questions, and we all benefited greatly from spending time with you. So let me say good night to John. I'd like everybody else to hang in there so I can tell you about our next event at Bay Area Skeptics. John, thank you very much. I hope we
My pleasure, and
next time.
I think your group is doing great stuff, and I'm happy to see you doing it.
Thanks so much.
Right. Bye-bye.
All right. I remind you that there is no Skep Talk for the second Thursday of July. In July, the Bay Area Skeptics is joining with other Northern California skeptics organizations to put on Skeptical, our annual skeptics organization. Now, this is an online conference, so you can attend it wherever you are on the planet. You don't have to be in the Bay Area to attend Skeptical. It's going to begin Friday night, July 19th, and extend through Sunday afternoon, July 21st. It's going to start out on Friday with a very innovative project that we hope you will participate in. World Skeptics in the Pub, the Global Skeptics in the Pub. Go to Bay Area Skeptic, go to skepticalcon.com. I've got this memorized, I really do. Maybe it's too late for me as well. Skepticalcon.com for more information about Global Skeptics in the Pub, as well as the other speakers and events that we'll be having. Now, join us on the second Thursday in September for the next Skep Talk. Our speaker will be well-known climate scientist Peter Sinclair, and he'll join us to talk about what can climate science tell us about the current year of extremes. That will be at 7:30 p.m. on here at YouTube as usual. I didn't give you the date. That will be September 12th. I'm sorry, August 8th, the second. I said the second Thursday in September. Holy mackerel. I'm getting things all confused. Too many little notes here. I'm talking about August 8th, Peter Sinclair, second Thursday in August, 7:30 p.m. Be here. We'll have a good time. And thanks for coming tonight as well. Good night.